on this computer. Hello, everybody. This is Will Harold, the Energy Hunter with Akashic Intelligence, the original AI, coming to you with the Walter Russell Secret of Light discussion group from the Rogue River in southern Oregon. Today we are going to continue with part 3 in the Secret of Light. We're going to discuss the Cubosphere and shapes and some other topics that Walter brought forth in this back part, which has the diagrams and is a little bit better explanation. We've done quite a few. We've almost been to this study for a year now. I mean, I think we're about 10 months into it. So thank you all for staying with me through all that time. It's been fun, and we've all made a very nice and tight group here to discuss these issues. So let's go ahead and get started. So as I talked about earlier, we're in the Walter Russell, The Secret of Light, Part 3. I say Part 3.2 because this is the second one in the Part 3 series. And what I did on this diagram, it will be the cover for the thumbnail, as they call it in YouTube, for the video. And what I did was I actually brought in a lot of his artwork that he had, and this all comes from the philosophy.org website. So people wanting this artwork, it can be purchased from the philosophy.org at a very reasonable price. I know Doug's bought quite a bit of it and has really enjoyed
So
it.
cheap. Beautiful.
Yeah. And so what I did was I put together a lot of these diagrams because they really do explain and show what we're going to discuss today. In the center, we actually have the cube, as you can see here, the square, with the sphere in the middle, and then as it's going and radiating out to the corners that we talked about last week to the octaves, each of the 8 corners of the cube make up the octaves that we're going to discuss. And so what Walter says is all things that are red, that's why this is red here, that is the positive, that is the heat, that is the male, is a sphere, and then that gets compressed down into cubes, and that's called the cubosphere. And if you were to take this sphere and actually chop it, cut a piece out of it, you would see these radial rings inside because there are no straight lines in God's universe. They're all curvature. There's curvature that is made through the polarities, through as the positive and the negative. And when we say negative, it's not that there is no charge. It's an opposite charge to the positive. And that's one thing that they've really tried to emphasize later on in Walter's work, is that there is no such thing as a neutral or negative charge. Therefore, the current scientific materialist idea of the atom with a neutron or a electron and proton, they're all pretty much a charged particle, but in equal and opposite directions. So as we look at these diagrams, we can see the ideas of the cubosphere being made. Again, here with the points of the spheres and the cube. And this is kind of like the Doppler effect again. If you were to take this sphere and chop it in half, here's what you'd have with these varying rings of light waves and waves in the center, and then from the center proceedeth forth the wave and the desire of the one or of God coming forth. One thing that I did find when I was looking, watching one of the videos on the philosophy.org website, was that magnetic light equals eternal life. So that within the one, once we return to source, so the idea of death is really man's idea. It's not the idea that's natural. We never die, we just change based on the waveform that we're in. So we're either in a series of expansion or contraction. And that is just a continuing effect from where we go from source to matter and then back to source. So within that, within the magnetic light equals eternal life. And then God's thinking is equal to magnetic light in action, or the wave, divided by rest. These were a couple of little equations or equalities that I saw that were on the video. So, like I said, this is his artwork. It can be purchased from philosophy.org, which is the website for the University of Science and Philosophy, which is Walter Russell's legacy project or legacy trust. So as we move forward here, we're going to, as we usually do, we are going to start with a little bit of a discussion of the design of the Divine Iliad, which is a book that Walter Russell wrote when he got his first download, and that was before he began to write all his books. And when he did that, he was given a direct insight into Source. And what Source told him was about the secret of light and about that all creation was within the wave. So let's go ahead and read this. This is, "See thou that man knows that each divided light of his conditioning, which extends from me," and again, when we see me, it's not Walter, this is Source or God or whatever you see as divine, "from me to him, is balanced always, for I am balance, and that is truth and the law, for I am truth and the law." That's interesting. He is truth and the law. "Say thou to him, each thing is everything, and each is everywhere. For I say that all things are the same thing, for all things are universal. Each thing reaches through every other thing to the farthermost star. For this purpose, I have set my mirrors and my lenses of dual light to attain an affinity in my imaged universe in which no measure is. And I also say that man's infinity ends in eyes of man where it began. All things in my mirrored universe end where they begin. Eternity thus ends in now, and now in eternity. See thou that man well knows the illusions which deceive his senses seeing. Point out to him my mirrors and my lenses, which curve my universe of seeming into imagined spheres of my thinking as seed for multiplying one into many ones. Any thoughts on that before I begin to kind of break it down? All right, so let's begin to kind of break it down a bit. And first thing that we start off with here is truth and the law. Now, I don't know if you guys remember or not, but we did a little series on spiritual sovereignty and we talked about the law. And we talked about the one-eyed gods because within the law, when we deal with law, the law is not duality. The law is the law. So under this heading, the ancients placed the various natural impulses and cosmic laws. They said that these were one-eyed because they were neither good nor evil, the two eyes presuming polarity. The ancients taught that natural law was no respecter of persons, performing its labors intelligently, but without partiality or feeling. Therefore, they named them one-eyed gods.
Giants.
Oh, sorry, one-eyed giants. So within that concept, we say that the law is without partiality. So there is one person is not going to receive a different outcome in the law because of some status, because of wealth, because of insight, the law will always remain the law. And there is no partiality in the law. And therefore, there is truth within that law. It remains the same. So the law will not change based on, a partiality. So the main number one law is the law of evolution, which means everything is constantly changing. There's nothing that we can do that will actually stop that law. We are either in a state of ascension or descension, of compression or in radiation. We are either growing or shrinking. So that is the wave, and that is the law. We get to rest or stillness, and then we keep moving through that point. Stillness does not last. So we can never really reach this state of homeostasis. Once we reach it, it's a period of rest for a moment, but then we'll go back into the wave itself. And so as we look at that, we also can see that when we talk about eternity, as I mentioned earlier in the first slide, magnetic light equals eternal life. So within eternity is the magnetic light, is the stillness of God, is the one, is the centering point from which all things flow, from which this magnetic stillness starts and begins to create the duality and polarity of thinking and the wave through its desire. That's what we covered a little bit last week. And so God's thinking equals magnetic light in action, which is the wave, divided by rest, which is at the points that we talked about that were the circles that were the waves had its inflection point. Any questions on what we just covered there, or comments? All right. So we're going to get back and talk a little bit about what we talked about last week, which was about the cubosphere and how the cubosphere is constructed and made. And as you remember,
I had a question. I'm sorry.
okay, go ahead.
The evolution part. I mean, is that related to Darwin's nonsense?
No.
Thank you.
No. Darwin has the concept of evolution, but his evolution is based on, well, what I would say is that the idea that we are taught of evolution was not really Darwin's idea of evolution. I think he's been taken and quoted out of context for a lot of the things he says to actually reinforce a scientific materialistic idea. I don't know if Darwin really believed that we came from monkeys, but that his concepts that he came from his work in the Galapagos Islands were meant to and taken and used just as everything else was. Every other scientific endeavor is kind of convoluted to fit the narrative. So that theory of evolution is true, that there is evolution, but whether that something is going to change from one thing to another is not evolution. Evolution is that you have a constant expansion and or declination, right, or radiation that's going on, not a change in the makeup. It's really this evolution and this evolving.
Good.
Can you go back to the last slide real quick?
The last slide, which was
Oh, well, I guess my point is kind of going off what Doug was saying about evolution or devolution. Do magnetic people affect the magnetics of that's sort of a joke, but not really, this evolution? Because it's all about the magnetics of the.
Well, again, I do believe, okay, and this again, this is guesswork, because I mean, I don't, Russell's not covered it, so since this is a Russell discussion, I don't think Russell actually covers that. But I do believe, and just as has been talked about, that there is a group consciousness, there is a zeitgeist that can be created, and that those that ascend or that change consciousness or go into a magnetic and look to source um, can affect the whole, and that's really what we'd call morphic resonance. If you study any Sheldrake, where it's like the idea of the, I think it's 100 monkeys, it's often called, is that once the first monkey learns something, it becomes easier and easier for the next monkeys to learn that. So yes, I believe that there is a magnetic that can aid in evolution, and that the first monkey to do it, or the first person to do it, or the first instance of it becomes greatly multiplied, applied in a faster fashion as it goes through this morphic resonance process. Does that answer your question, Grant? Okay. So let's get back to what we were talking about with the cubosphere. And as we were beginning to, and the only reason I'm really covering this is because I did find some better diagrams, I think. And it's a little bit of a tricky subject, but it is the main concepts of what Russell is trying to discuss here. So let's go ahead and talk a little bit more about that. So here in the cubosphere, if you remember, we have, first of all, we have, you know, this centering effect, which is there's an outward explosion from the center, which we call radiation, which is female. And this, I mean, from the center out is actually blue. So anytime we see blue, expansion, radiation, female, okay, death. And I don't mean that females are death, but that's the side that Russell talks about. Because as we expand, we become more spiritual and less physical. So it's really more of a death in the idea of the death of a physical body. The forces that come from outside in are called compression. They are red, they are male, they are positive, and they are hot, heat. So what's happening is that we're getting these centering forces going out, and we get these compressing forces going in. And it's like the heartbeat. It's like the breath. The breath in, life. Breath out, death. Okay? That's this breath of life, of nature, of everything going on. So as we have this, the 3D planes are created. So the X, Y, and Z axes are created to create 3D. And as that 3D is made up, the cube is a female concept. It is blue, it is cold, it is negative, and the sphere is red, it is hot, it is male. So this is as we, and I think the idea that we kind of need to actually look at a bit is what the idea of, say, life. And if we can kind of see it with the idea of say sperm fertilizing an egg, right? So the initial of a man would be an explosion outward, right? And that explosion would then lead to the sperm, finding the egg, infiltrating the egg, and then we have this expansion going on, right? We have the multiplication of the cells, the growth of the cells, and so on. And as the cells grow, what you kind of have to realize here is that it is not a linear process. It's not like you have expansion, then you have contraction, and then you have expansion, and then you have... These are going on at the same time. As the cells are multiplying, we also have the condensing of the cells within to become more solid. So we're having this very, very liquid form that we're having, a very viscous form. And then as it expands, it also densifies. So that as it densifies, we get multiplication. So the egg begins to multiply, it begins to form. And we begin to see much more going on with it. So, we get the zygote, begins to form. We see the pulsation here. So this is expanding, it's getting larger, but it's also at the same time contracting because it's getting denser in form. So the wave is happening, all right? I mean, it's not like the wave, like it expands and it contracts in just one factor. It's happening simultaneously. And then as that, begins, we even get, this type of thing right here, where each of these things, this is the wave right here, the expansion, the contraction, expansion, contraction. Life is forming. It's not that expansion happens, then contraction happens. It's happening simultaneously. But there are then larger cycles of a death and growth cycle where the man or woman reaches a certain point of densification where the bones become very solid and then they begin to actually reverse. But that, again, you have the smaller on each individual part, but then you have the larger of the, what they would call the life-death cycle of expansion and contraction going back to source. So I kind of want to say that because I just don't want people to think that it's just like, one directional and then the other direction. It's happening simultaneously, but in a larger focus of the wave in an overall life plan. Any questions on that?
Guess what the first organ is that comes out of the heart?
First organ. Don't know.
The tongue.
Really?
Yeah, the tongue is a very powerful part of our spirituality.
Yeah, well, we speak things into, I mean, that's, in the beginning was the word and the word became
Yeah,
flesh, right?
so I just wanted to tie that in there.
Yeah, so that's great. Thank you.
In Hebrew, though.
So,
That was real sperm and eggs, that video?
no, I think it was a animation.
Oh, it's too bad. That was so cool.
Wasn't it cool?
Yeah.
I don't even know that's really happening, right? That's what we're being told is happening, but that's the idea behind it all. I think, that we have some pretty good footage, I believe, on the growth of the zygote itself, but I don't know if we have it really on the sperm coming up the canal and all that. So, as we begin to talk about this, and we begin to actually, really begin to visualize and understand that wave happening in a very small area, but then also in the larger, and that's what Russell wants us to understand, is that it is, this multiplicity of wave. It's not just one wave. It's millions of waves happening at the same time, and at different. As I think Brian asked last week about frequency of what is the frequency and so on, and so we have billions of waves happening at different frequencies, at different intervals and time frames, and at different cycles. And as we, as humans, begin to understand this, and then we begin to understand our universe and begin to see this, we can have a greater understanding of how this reality works, and we may be able to live in a more constructive and resonant way with our environment. So this was a diagram that I found, which kind of shows a little bit better, I think, some of the things we've talked about. So this is illustrating nature's method of winding light up into solid spheres to create the condition of gravity and through trough and crest of waves. So as you can see here, from the corner it goes to the center. We have the centrifugal and centripetal actions happening that will go to the corners and within the 3D planes to begin to form the sphericals that we talked about. Again, here it's kind of the cube with the wave going through the centers, which is causing the spheres to be created, which will expand out. And so this is a Russell drawing of that concept. As we talk about this, the creation of all forms of matter eternal interchange between the Father. Again, when you see Father, we see red, we see heat, we see positive, we see male, we see sun. Light of incandescent spheres and the mother light of cold cubes. So when we see mother light, we see negative, we see blue, we see cold, we see female. That's why I have it. So as I've toned down the red and the blue in the preceding stuff, in the after stuff, so that, as Doug said, this might be dark, it might be hard to see the words underneath, but so all forms are born in the direction of the coldness of space and are voided in the direction of incandescence. So this is in the direction. So as we talked about earlier, we have the incandescent sun, goes forth and forms planets in the coldness of space. There the wave action happens, and it will return back in the direction of the incandescence of the sun, or back to the sun. Coldness of space form, back to incandescence, back to source. Every creating body is sent out into space from its crucible in the sun to cool into the form appropriate to its extension from the sun. So what Walter Russell is saying here is that the sun is the creator. The sun is the idea of the creation. Things proceed forth from the sun, out into space, cool, form, then begin to expand back towards the incandescence of the sun. So they cool into the form appropriate to the extension from the sun. That is one half of the cycle. Cyclic journey of every body from the sun and back to it. The other half of the cycle is the return to the sun to void the body of its form for the purpose of acquiring a new body. Every cycle or motion is a journey from heat, again, father, positive, heat, red, male, cold, mother, negative, female, and back again. So as we look at this and get a little bit better, so here's another drawing of what he's talking about. So as we have this cubosphere here, within it are the three planes of X, Y, and Z. In the center, we're having all these explosions happening from the outward, the expansion, which is going in, and then going to form these spheres, because we also have the outward pressure of gravitation condensing. So we have the expansion of the radiation. We have the outward pressure. So that, as you remember, we were watching that, video, the zygote, and we saw the pulsation, that breathing in and out, in and out. That is what's happening here. We have this expansion and we have this compression. So the curvature matures, and then the curvature disappears back into the sun. The other area that we talked, and then I also found this diagram, which I thought was pretty good, but I couldn't really get a very good image of it. It's kind of blurred here. But so this is the evolution of mass from plane to sphere. So we kind of start out as this kind of, vortexy circulating cosmos that begins to congeal and get solid as we go out. And then it begins to oblate a bit, and then we get the sphere. And from the sphere, we kind of get this toroidal, and we go back to what we had before, and then we go back to source. So within this concept, we have the appearance and the disappearance. Again, we're seeing positive, negative, right? Positive, negative, negative, positive. The road to appearance of form in mass must be by the way of plane. So we start off with a plane, we go to a sphere. Then the road to disappearance of form in mass must be by the way of plane. So we get plane, sphere, back to source. Right here is where supposedly we are today in our Earth. Saturn is beginning to oblate more because it's the oldest form. That's why it has the rings. And so we're seeing that this is the concept that Russell had, of how mass is shaped into spheres. Any questions on what we just discussed there?
I kind of had like one of those teenage revelations of like, is that why girls are always cold? That's sort of a joke.
Well, yes, it is in a sense, and that's why guys are always hot, because they have the red and the blue. But once women actually are pregnant, right, and they have this going on inside of them, they actually will be much warmer.
Yannick is asking if he's missing it. He could still join us.
Yes.
Maybe.
I'll give
Yeah.
him. Can you answer him? I don't want to pull that up on the screen with all our stuff.
Okay, let me see if I can answer him.
So, as I was going through some of these diagrams, I also came across this one, which I thought was pretty cool, because it really kind of reminded me a little bit about biogeometry, orgone. So as I was kind of looking at this, I saw this diagram, which talks a bit about how we have, this vapor cloud on the earth, we have iron and we have stone, and then we have water, which creates this vapor cloud. And as we make orgone, we have the iron, we have metal, and then we have what we would call a natural material, which could be stone or some other material. And when you make the cloud buster, which is the, kind of breaking the vapor cloud, we actually put something in between. So this is kind of a little bit, I think this could almost be looked at as a little bit of how orgone is created within our, the idea behind orgone and cloud busting and so on. So I found that kind of, so solids are compressed gases and are divided solids. So hopefully Yannick will come on. I don't think you have to let him in. I think he can just come in on his own. So as we begin to look at these concepts of how matter is made, how matter is set forth. Shoot. There we go.
Mhm.
That's the matter that's doing this.
The matter that, right now, you mean? No, this is called too much stuff going on. Okay. So we talked a bit about the cubosphere. We talked a bit about how it comes into existence. Now we're actually going to look at geometric forms and the decahedron and so on. So all bodies are formed by freezing and voided by melting. All right. So as they proceed forth from the sun, they start from source, they go out and they begin to cool into planets. As the planets begin to heat, they begin to face the next phase of the wave, and they begin to radiate, and they begin to radiate back into source. So we have so they're going out and freezing, coming back in. The freezing and melting points of all bodies are dependent upon the respective densities and electric conditioning. The sphere is the clays of the earths, the light of suns, and the formlessness of seed. It is the womb from which the clay of earth extends into the cube, again, blue, female, negative, bound heavens, to expansion, and its tomb within which all form is voided for giving to the heavens as a new form. So we have the outward pressure of gravitation pushing in. We have the outward expansion. And this is kind of a tough concept to grasp because, expansion's death, but we have to realize they're both going on at the same time. It's not like we have expansion and then contraction. This is a action that's happening at the same time, separate polarities, same intensity, but it does vary upon where the wave happens. So say like with a man, or we looked at the child being born, right? We see him expanding, we see him growing, we see the cells multiplying, okay? That is radiation. That is the female principle. That is the negative principle. But as that is going on, the tissues, the bone, everything else is becoming more congealed, right? It's also condensing. So we have expansion and condensing going on at the same time. Now, in the bigger cycle of that, as the child comes out and is born, he is going to now enter a cycle of expansion and contraction of life, right? He's going to begin to go through life and grow. Now, when we get to about the age of 45, 42, 45, somewhere in there, then that cycle begins to reverse, and we are at the height of our strength and our vitality at 45, expanding and contracting. But then the wave will change and we will begin to oblate, right? We will begin to lose our strength. We'll get a little bit thicker in the middle, right? This is where we get now the side of the wave that we're on is highly more radiative than it is gravitational. So even though we have this gravitation radiation going on constantly, we can have that going on at a different point and a different cycle within the overall wave form. Because that's happening for us, but it's also happening for millions of other things in the universe at the same time. And we are all one. And what's happening to us is happening everywhere. Any questions or comment on what I just said?
Well, I like the idea that when we leave the physical plane, the elements go back to nature, and we get a chance to, I guess, create a new body again. You know what I mean? With so that death cycle, if you like, that we think of it as that, it's actually beneficial.
Yes, and it is a death life cycle, right? I mean, what
Yeah.
it says is that
Yeah.
death is really a concept of man's.
Yeah.
It is a life cycle. It's just that the life has to go through its cycle of radiation and gravitation. And when we're in the gravitation, but how consciousness, and we've talked a bit about that also now, how consciousness interacts with that, right? Do we, as we go through this cycle, does each individual carry with them through these cycles, his consciousness, and if he does, what part of that consciousness does he carry through this wave cycle? And, some of it would be that we actually carry we lose the emotional body, but we may carry the id or the self through these cycles. Therefore, that's how we can do remembering or past life regression, because we can carry this one portion with us. Now, we may not carry, the trauma. We can have generational trauma that's carried also. But the idea is that we kind of try to lose that portion of our body through this incarnation, that we rectify that karma so we don't carry that with us. And we really only carry the id or the remembering that could be beneficial to us in the next incarnation. So as we're going through the cycle with our body, we are carrying a piece of us as our consciousness to be reincarnated with us at the next incarnation. Any ideas or comments on what I just said?
Well, I think as we grow, we hope by the time we reach, I don't know, 50, 60, we have a little bit more wisdom than when we were at 21. Okay, like, you know what I mean? Like, we grow in a different way. Maybe our body is, you know, less strength and all that. But also we've learned to, well, I'll say conserve energy or use our energy, extend ourselves less to unnecessary things. So in a way, even older, we know lots of people can accomplish a lot even when they're 70, 80, because I think they've perfected what it is that they've come to play a role in. You know what I mean? Anyway.
And this is something that we were discussing today on the chat also, was just the idea of good and evil and so on. And, you know, is it from God? Is it man's perception? Is it that we're really learning how to perceive the world? And is that, you know, the idea of how we perceive tied into this concept of good and evil? Because our bodies are part of the transmitter and receiver for all this information that we're receiving. So that's how, because we are born of man, that DNA structure that we start with, as that little zygote that we saw, has generational trauma that could come from ancestors that we don't even know or that we had anything to do with. So, but that is in our DNA, it's in our structures, it's in our body, and we will have to deal with that. So how advanced we are, you know, spiritually, inner, emotionally, and so on, and how we can deal with that, we can either resolve that generational trauma or we maintain the cycle through multiple generations. So it's very important that we do this inner work, that we actually begin to see the world as Walter Russell talks about it, as this wave, and we can identify and maybe rectify the behavior and the consciousness that we carry into the next incarnation, so that we don't take that generational trauma with us to next generations.
As long as they don't create a universal TSA.
They might.
They're working on it.
Any other comments before we begin to talk about forms? All right, so let's begin with our form. So every form in nature is either becoming a cube, blue, or a sphere, red, hot, or is a section of either one. Complex bodies are multiples of spheres of matter surrounded by multiples of cubes of space in multiple wave fields. So this is really the first time that Russell begins to incorporate the idea of wave fields. Before we were just talking about the wave, and now we're talking about wave fields, which is multiple waves working in unison or harmony, or, and again, you know, a field, and I would say it like within, if you look at Sheldrake's idea of morphic resonance and morphic fields, it'd be the idea kind of when you see a school of fish and they all are kind of working in unison and they all turn at the same time and they all kind of, you know, flow together. How do they know that? How does each fish know the other fish is turning? Do you think he sees it and they all move? No, it's actually a field that's actually working with them, and as they go in this motion, they're actually in this wave, they're feeling it. I mean, that's just part of them, and they are reacting within this field of resonance, within this morphic field, within this wave field. So all crystal shapes are sections of cubes. Their shapes are determined by their positions in the wave field. So there's a field that's incorporating not just one wave, but the whole field that we talked about earlier within the diagrams of the sphere expanding into the cubes. Those are fields. All these fields are interconnected. The cubes of space, again, blue, female, of space are wave fields which bound all interchanging motion between the two conditions within it. So we have the motion inside, as we talked about earlier. Let me see if I can get up there without causing too much issue here. Well, maybe I will cause issue. Let's go down. let's look at this one here. So see, within here, we have all this action happening. We have all this outward radiation, okay, that is being caught, right? It's being held within this sphere, within this cube. This cube is creating the boundary for the outward explosion that's happening and being compressed by the inward. Yes. Much too slow. So within these fields of this compression and radiation, man, this is not a good way to navigate. These crystals are formed. So we talked about this a bit with the wave fields, the cubes of space. So the cubes of space are wave fields which are bounded, right, by the motion between the two conditions within. Motion cannot pass through these planes, but can be reflected symmetrically backward or extended symmetrically toward the center of the adjoining wave field. So these cubes are like the boundaries of each of these explosions or radiation that can only be reflected back, which is the gravitation, which causes the form, which causes the sphere, which causes the red, right? So as this explosion occurs, it can only go to a certain point. It's either reflected back, it cannot penetrate those planes. That's how come the sphere is formed. As it's reflected back, it creates the heat, creates the sphere. Any questions or comments to this point?
Well, when I look at these shapes, like the crystals that you're showing, I think of people that know the properties or the healing properties of wearing certain stones, or you know what I mean? Because it contains a certain field, I guess.
Correct.
It's within it, and it's the form. Anyway, I'm just saying, it's fascinating, really.
Well, this is what gets back to biogeometry, where the wave field is a property of the form, shape, and angle, and number. So, these concepts all relate to each other. They're, again, just a little bit different approach to how we're looking at them. So yeah, so with, I do a lot of what they call Taoist stone medicine, which I took from Robert Gilbert at the Vesica Institute. I'd recommend that class to anybody. But that deals with stones, and their shape and their color. Because that color, like say you get a purple fluorite, that purple resonates much more with the spiritual realm. And then its shape also, like I have a cube purple fluorite that's very spiritual stone. And when you get into whites, you also deal with, a spiritual plane. And then you get into the blacks and the blues, which are much more earthly, and deal like an Indio Gabbro stone is much more calming, So, and the shape of that, like if you get a spherical shape with an Indio Gabbro, I think you have one, Giselle, too.
Concave.
Yeah.
Concave.
Yeah. That has a much more grounding effect than with the spiritual effect, and it can be actually a protective type stone. So yeah, so the shape and where that was mined has a big influence too, of where its position was on the earth and what influences were going on with that stone, with how it was formed.
In my life, I've had pieces of jewelry made, 2 different types of amethyst, but eventually, when it was no longer needed, it disappeared. It would just fly away from my hand. Okay, I'm not kidding when I say that. I lost it twice, kind of thing. So I even asked my TCM doctor what it means, and he was a bit of an astrologer, and he said, yeah, well, when was that? And they would look at so it's interesting how certain stone can show up in your life and then they disappear. when you don't need it anymore or whatever. So anyway, the universe decides in a way.
Yes.
It's interesting.
And so, as
Would you also say that the stone finds you?
I bet, like, I just say, yeah, well, the people that are really into it, for sure, people that go and dig stones in California or whatever. I've known people, obviously they know what could be the possibilities of these things, for sure.
And so, as we talk about the cubes and the spaces, and so we talked about how, we reached this point in the cube where it cannot penetrate, can either only be mirrored back and begin to create this sphere that we talked about. So within each cube field is the curved universe. So it's a curved universe, not a straight line universe of two-way light illusion. And beyond to the farthest reaches of space is a repetition of illusion from wave field to wave field. So again, we're talking wave field, not just a single wave. It's a multiplication of waves creating fields. And then to wave field at the rate of 146,400 miles per second, which is supposedly the speed of light when you look at, when you're doing calculations or looking at what we're talking about. But what Walter Russell says, that is the speed in which every action-reaction anywhere repeats itself everywhere. This illusion of motion gives rise to the belief that light travels. So that's where I'm saying here that the speed of light that you'll see is the idea that it's 186,000 miles per second. What Walter Russell's saying is that light is not traveling, but what we're seeing is the action. So I would say if you had a series of light bulbs, say, 100 long, and each one lit up separately but in sequence, that would give you an illusion that light was traveling. But it's not. It is just this creation of the multiplication that is giving you the illusion of travel, but it's really the refraction and the condensation of light at this rate of 186,000 miles per second. So do you understand that Walter Russell doesn't believe that light travels, but that it is the reaction that we're seeing that gives us the illusion of movement? Any comments or questions on what I just said?
Yeah. So is that similar to an ocean wave where the water particles themselves actually just oscillate up and down or back and forth, but it gives you the illusion of a traveling wave?
Correct. Very similar, I would say. And because that wave almost actually mimics the sine wave, right? The wave that we see. All right.
I think Mac Presti gives a good illustration with his cube mirror. I don't know if anyone's seen that.
Yes. And I was actually trying to pull up a picture of that to share, but I really couldn't find a good, still shot of it. But yes.
And what corroborates the cube mirror is that if anyone's also seen an ion ray microscopy of an atom, it's very similar to what the cube mirror reflects back, essentially.
Yes. And you can go to the website of the philosophy.org, and under videos you can see what Yannick's talking about. So wave field boundary planes of zero curvature, insulate all effects of motion which take place within it. For every other wave field, centering the wave field is the incandescent sphere which mates it. The potential of the entire field is divided equally between its centering sphere of multiplied matter and surrounding space of divided matter. So as we talked about earlier, we have this cube that as we have the center, it actually begins to radiate out, just like, okay, so think about the sun, maybe that is a sphere, but as it radiates out, right, it's creating these planets, right? And the planets then begin to congeal, and as they warm, they begin to go back. So within this, there's all these cubes, there's all these spheres, and there's multiplicities of them that are separated by space between each of these spheres. So within Walter Russell's universe, there are spheres that are in different phases of the wave. They're either obligating down into a sphere from plane to, oval to sphere, back to oval, back to plane, and then they come back out again. So what phase of the wave those are in will determine their shape, where they are at on that wave cycle. So as again, when you see, this, so each mate of each wave field, again, multiple waves in the universe, is balanced with its opposite mate gosh darn it, it bugs me. With its opposite mate, even to the weight of one electron. The reason why the centering sphere, again, red, hot, is of high potential, and its surrounding space is cold, right? Space is cold, female, surrounding space is of low potential, is due to the difference of the volume. So when we see a sphere, we know there's great distances between it, right? Between that and the next sphere. So we have great distances of space. So the sphere has a minimal volume, right? To where the space between the spheres has much higher volume. And so that would be called low potential based on volume versus higher potential, smaller volume. So the same amount of energy, right? Same amount of energy, because we have this two-way motion. It's not energy increases or decreases. The energy that came to make the sphere then obligates out as it begins to radiate, same amount of energy out, but it's in a much larger area. So it's of much lower potential. So it's due to the volume of each of those wave fields. The centering sphere may be a few thousand miles in diameter, a planet, whatever we want to call it. Could be a few inches in diameter, right? Compared to where it's going to expand to. And its surrounding space, again, blue, right? Female, negative. Many miles or many millions of miles in diameter, yet they are equal potential for potential, but unequal volume for volume. That's why we call a sphere having high potential, hot, male, positive, to the low potential of space, which is cold, female, and blue. Neither of these mates could sustain its separateness of a condition unless it constantly interchanged to give all of itself to the other alternately in respective cycles. So again, we have the juxtaposition, and some people call it positive and negative, but really what they're trying to say is they're both the same but opposite charge. So positive and positive, but in separate directions. One is centrifugal, one is centripetal, right? Centripetal is the red, it's the hot, it's the male. Centrifugal is the counterclockwise spin. It is out, it is female, it is cold. Equal yet opposite, but varying in potential based on volume. Any questions so far?
Well, based on this, that's why each planet or spheres out there, or
Mhm.
the way the universe is, can
Mhm.
keep its balance.
Correct.
know?
Correct. Correct.
I mean, even while it's doing all this motion.
Correct. And we're going to have a little diagram of that coming up here that I found, which was very enlightening on from Walter Russell's A New Universe or A New Theory of the Universe.
And that would be the reason as well, where as we go forward in cycles, some planets will appear
Mm-hmm. Correct.
eventually,
Mhm.
you
And
know,
some will disappear.
and some will disappear.
Correct.
Mhm.
It's just the law of
Life.
evolution. It's just the law of
Life.
evolution, right?
It's life.
Yep. Correct. So as we journey forth in this, so neither of these mates could sustain its separation of condition unless it, okay, we talked about that. So spheres must give to cubes of space. So the red, right, the hot, the male, must give to cubes, the cold, the female, the negative, of space by breathing out, right? The breath, breathing out to discharge cubes of space by breathing out. So again, when you think about breathing out, this is radiation, this is the death cycle, this is the negative, this is a female. And charge space. Space must then re-give to spheres by breathing out from itself to discharge itself and recharge spheres. So as space breathes out, it recharges the spheres. This has to happen. We have to be giving. This is what we would call the equity of exchange, equally balanced exchange, right? This is the key. If we don't have equal balanced exchange, this is where we get tornadoes, storms, other things occurring, because we have imbalance. When you have imbalance, you don't have the equity, you end up with chaos becoming into play. And what will happen is there will be an adjustment in either the gravitation or the radiation to bring that back into balance. Again, we were talking a bit about this in the chat. This is the male-female concept, right? Anytime I say radiation or gravitation, when I say radiation, you could say female, right? When I say gravitation, you could say male. These are polarities. These are what's happening. We would call them gender, but they are just the forms of energy that are happening. So each short cycle of interchange is accumulated into longer life-death cycles in which solids entirely disappear into space, as you were talking about, Giselle, blue, interchanges its potential to become solid. So as the potential becomes high, we get the higher concentration, the higher congealing, this making into a solid. Then this principle constitutes the forever inside-outside inturnings of nature by means of which all form sequentially appear, red, hot, positive, male, disappear, cold, female, negative, and reappear, red, hot, male, positive. So as we look at this, and there was a question that you had asked earlier, Giselle, about, is this how things maintain balance? So this was a diagram that I found, from Walter Russell's, I think it was called The New Idea of the Universe or whatever it is. So all mass is controlled by invisible polarized forces in space. Tides are one of the nature decompressing forces that are centrifugally dominated and help increase the speeds of the Earth's rotation. Mutual gravity center around which both masses revolve. So as you can see here, So within Walter Russell's cosmology, he believes that the Earth's a sphere and that the Moon's a sphere, that they have mass, that they have polarities, and that they are acting upon one another within the universal or cosmos, which is being held together by these polarities of this outward force, right, which is radiation, being worked upon by a force going to the center, which is the gravitational, to complete the sphere. And each one of these are actually putting out these forces at the same time. And in between, we have this negative and positive. So tides, deserts, belts, rings, and satellites disintegrate planets as planets eventually disintegrate suns by oblating them. So all sphere will disintegrate through radiation, through oblating, just as Saturn and its rings begin to disappear. Any questions on what we're talking about there? So with no questions, I guess, at this point, any questions? Doug, anybody have a question? So, so all things are both male. This is one thing that we talked about today in the chat, right? All things are both male and female, being one or the other only in preponderance. So all effects of motion obey this universal rhythmic cycle law of order preponderances. So as we can see here, life and death meet here. Maturity, equilibrium, all opposites effect of motion move always in opposite directions. So here's what we were talking about. Equal but opposite exchange, right? Equity of balanced interchange. That's what we're talking about here. Each of these lines are equal but opposite. But they will change in intensity or in preponderance as they go through the cycle of the wave. So as I said, a man will begin as a child, he will grow, he will condense, he will become his strongest, he will become his most vital at the age of 45. Maybe longer if you do other things, if you actually work a bit, maybe more, and aid some of the cycles, like I think Grant was even talking about, through how he may eat, how he may work on himself, and so on and so forth, not become toxic. He may continue to grow. I think Bear says that that may actually be 60, 70, 80 based on how long you actually may extend your wave cycle. The normal cycle may be 80 years, 90 years, but we may be able to expand that cycle based on how we live, how we grow, and so on and so forth, how much trauma we dissipate, so on and so forth.
Don't have radiation killing us, EMFs.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, not only that, but like there's been some gene editing happening in our recent past that affects our lifespan as well. Like humans used to live hundreds of years, but now it's shortened to a point where it's hard to gain enough wisdom to send.
Yes.
But I'm not complaining.
But
and
then it comes down into what can we do? Are we victims or can we actually change those things, right? And that's where it really comes into what we'd call inner work or conscious effort, right? Can we actually change we are creator beings. That's Russell's key point. All things that are manifest, we manifest. We create our reality, we create what we see, what we experience, what we do. So if we're told we only live to be 80 years old, and that's our mindset, that's our belief, then we may only live to be 80 years old. We will create that reality. If we're told we, live 120 years, we may create that reality. If we're told we live 500 years, we may create that reality. I don't know, but I do know that what Walter Russell says is that we do create our own reality, but we are limited by the cycle of the wave. The wave will continue with its life-death cycle. But we will never die. We will continue. just in a different form, to be recreated from radiation to gravitation, from heat to cold. Any comments on what I just said?
It's great the way he says also with the stars and the black holes, like it's, there's always, you know, a star as an equal black hole and, you know, et cetera. So they balance always.
Exactly.
All the nonsense with everything gets sucked into the black hole and, you know, everything goes away. It just can't happen.
And that's why for me, I have a, you know, there is for me some peace in knowing that it's all balanced, right? And it's all working without anything I do. These things are still going on and staying in balance. And the thing that I have to remember is to always concentrate on this, you know, equal balanced interchange. Am I having an equal balanced interchange daily in my life? Or am I getting off balance? Am I getting skewed one way or the other? So how does that manifest in my life that I have equal balanced interchange to propagate and live in harmony with the rest of the universe?
Kind of going with that. One time Leonard Cohen was asked, it's a film that they made on him when he was very young, and he's interviewed on the stage with other poets, if you like. Anyway, and he says, every morning I get up, I have to check if I'm in a state of grace, basically, and how the day is going to be based on my state of grace, meaning align with imbalance. Anyway, I just remember because once a year I watch this particular documentary they did on him, and there's other Canadian authors on there. Anyway, it was kind of interesting, even young, when he was writing poetry before he started to sing and all this, he already had that sense of balance, you know.
Mm-hmm. And that kind of gets into this interesting concept of grace, of where does grace come from? Does it come from outside of us, from a God or a Savior? Or is it granted by ourselves to ourselves and to others? So does man grant grace or does God grant grace? Well, we looked at gods. If we follow the theory of a one-eyed God, right, where there is no respecter of person, times, or situations, then we don't receive grace. We just receive the law. But we can maybe grant each other and ourselves grace. Any comments on what I just said there? All right, so we'll move on to the next. So the in-breathing of spheres, red, hot, positive, male, generates low potential into high. The generative process of nature is gravitational, red, hot. The outbreathing, cold, female, of spheres, radiates high potential into low. The degenerative process of nature is radiation. So as we've already talked about, this expansion, this degeneration, this breaking up is radiation. Multiplication and division of expressed energy into high and low potential of gravitation, red, to radiation, blue, is made possible by the plan of nature, which causes all actions of nature to extend radially from omnipresent points of magnetic light. So from the magnetic light, from the still center, we have this radiation, this radial expansion, and gravitation pulls spirally inward. So in a clockwise direction, spirally inward. This is the toroidal field we've talked about. So we have this gravitational pulling in, male, hot, clockwise spin, from within to wind light waves into solids to center space. So as it winds in, solid, positive, clockwise. Then it will radiate out, thrust spirally outward, counterclockwise, equal but opposite to the clockwise spin of the other direction, to unwind dense solids into space to surround solids. Each is equal reaction of the other. Each becomes the other sequentially. Gravitation is the positive electric principle, which exerts its pressure centripetally toward the maximum incandescent points of compression in every wave field. It is the father principle of nature, the integrating principle of uphill flow of energy, which forever balances its downhill flow. So we have the diagram here showing, the center, the pool of gravitation. This is actually showing the pool of gravitation in and the thrust of radiation out. So pulling in, thrusting out. Radiation is a negative electric principle which exerts its pressure centrifugally toward its wave field boundary planes of magnetic light. It is the mother principle of nature, the disintegrating principle of downhill flow energy, which forever balances its upflow. So these are some of the same concepts that we've talked about before. I mean, a lot of this is just repetition of the ideas of radiation, gravitation, inward flow, equally opposed, forming spheres, so on and so forth. But now we're going to talk a little bit about Steiner, just to throw something different in. So radiation is this negative principle that we've talked about. So the creator extends power of motion to but one half of a cycle for each of the two opposites, manifestations of his desire. Gravity gives a material form to bodies to manifest the ideas of bodies. Radioactive gives spiritual formlessness to the heavens for giving earth as formed bodies. Gravity begins its half cycle as the inward explosion reaction of an outward explosion action, thus fulfilling the law that all opposite expressions are born from each other and interchanging become the other. It ends its half cycle at a point of rest at the still point of magnetic light, which centers every material body, whether of microcosmic or macrocosmic dimension. Gravity then ceases when its motion ceases. So one thing that we might want to look out here is that gravity is this inward compressing force that forms density and makes everything into a solid. Within Steiner cosmology, this could almost be considered an Ahrimanic force, which is a bit different in the sense that with Ahriman, he's trying to create a denser and denser Earth, a denser and denser planet. So he's going past the point of rest and not going into radiation, but beginning to go in what we call the sub-nature planes, the subplanes of nature. So it's a degenerative male positive force that is beginning to condense past the point and just compressing. This is why within biogeometry there's Ibrahim Karim tells a story of working with kind of like negative forces, and that the fellow who was doing that became mummified, just became so densified. So that is almost like an Ahrimanic force that we have out of control. On the other side, we have this radiation force, this radial force that is going into the heavens. And this is almost what we could call a luciferic force, because it's trying to take us off the earth into a totally spiritual realm and is turning everything from solidity into spiritual formlessness. So within this cosmology, we almost could say that these two factors are also working, and this could be some of the science behind those two concepts of Ahriman and Lucifer. So it ends its half cycle at a point of rest at the still point of magnetic light. So at the still point of magnetic light, we could almost call this the Christ consciousness, which centers every material body, whether of Mike. So within this centering is the Christ consciousness, is the stillness. So if we continue to fall down into this materialism and so on, without stopping and resting at the still magnetic light of Christ consciousness, we will then fall into the Ahrimanic or subplanes of energy, the 5Gs and so on. The same thing is as if we radiate out, we don't stop at the Christ consciousness, the middle, the centering force. We will continue just to become spiritual without body and almost become a Luciferic being. And again, I'm saying this, if we're doing it outside the cycle of the wave, because the wave will have its natural form and we will, go into solidity, but we can go past that if we don't center on a Christ consciousness at the center of this still magnetic light. So this can be seen as maybe the science behind what Steiner's saying within those concepts. Any comments on what I just said?
Well, it may be why, I don't know, the air that we're breathing these days, or what's missing in the food, we get more and more dry,
Mm-hmm. Correct.
and we have to keep replenishing magnesium, you know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
Something is happening out there that's causing us to crystallize, if you like more dry.
Yeah, it's called
we need to work on that.
Yeah, it's calcification. It's really what's
that's what I meant, calcification.
Yeah.
And one thing I learned from Dr. Lando or even my homeopath, that whole idea that you have out there that we have to take calcium all the time.
Mm-hmm.
It's like the last thing you want to do.
Mm-hmm.
Like it's I don't know what it is. It's like the advice they give out there is actually not beneficial to us.
Mm-hmm.
But
well, there's certain types
people could take, if people could take magnesium, that's a different story.
Yeah, but there is certain types of calcium.
I'm sure.
That are more beneficial. They're telling us to take the wrong type of calcium.
Yeah, well, that's what I mean. Like whatever the normal whatever capsule you have out there, you might as well just throw it in the garbage. But anyway.
Yeah, and that's causing, like you said, the calcification.
That's right.
And
because then I've got siblings where calcification in the bone, like pains in articulation, and then they have to use laser to, So anyway, we need to understand more about this, obviously. Okay.
And that's why I'm kind of bringing it up, so maybe we can actually put it into a cosmology
that's
a little bit more understandable, correct?
Yeah.
Because I know that when I was over in Santa Clara, and that's where they actually brought out, some of the first rungs of the 5G, the tests and so on. There was a lot of young people that when I'd go to these hardware stores to buy concrete or whatever in bags, and I'd be at 60 years old throwing the bags in the truck, they couldn't even move, because they were so inundated with waves. When they weren't working, they were playing video games, they were eating, DoorDash. And so as we get the GMOs in us also, which promote this calcification, which promote this solidity of muscle mass of our bodies, this is really kind of that Ahrimanic influence that is pushing us deeper and deeper into matter. And so, and then once we lose any idea of spirituality, we have no ability to radiate through this spiritual method. So we are only going to become denser and denser as we pursue scientific materialism.
Yeah, it's interesting that humans are the only species that drinks like milk throughout their whole life from another, obviously from another species, but yeah, too much calcium.
So there is no center of gravity in nature. The centering light of every mass is still magnetic light. Likewise, the still axis of every vortex is still magnetic light. Radiative then begins its half cycle from that point of rest and ends on the wave field boundary planes of magnetic light where gravity began. Radiativity then ceases when its motion ceases. Both gravity and radiativity borrow their power to find balance and rest at their journey's end from the point of rest of their beginning. They each repay their separate borrowings to the other at every point of the respective journey. Each thus perpetually voids itself by giving to the other. At each journey's end, each opposite cancels itself out by giving. Death gives to life that life may live, and life gives to death that death may die. So within each cycle, whether it be the life cycle or the death cycle, this does not mean that in the death cycle we are dead. It just means that we are in the radiative cycle of life. It's really not a death life cycle. It's a life cycle that goes both positive and negative with incarnation into a 3D physical realm. Sometimes we're in the 3D realm and conscious, and sometimes we're in the spiritual realm and conscious. We are always conscious, just with or without form. But there is no death. So as we begin to talk a little bit about life and death cycles, right? We're almost done here. That every action in nature demonstrates that principle. A ball thrown in the air must start from a point of rest, motivated by energy borrowed from the center of gravity of this earth, which is its fulcrum. The point of rest is the thrower's hand, is an extension of the earth's still center. As the ball ascends, it decelerates as it gets higher, as it pays its borrowed energy back. So this is the idea that as I'm throwing it, right? I'm throwing it out, center point, radiative up. That the gravitation of, not that the Earth's pulling it, but there's a force pushing it down. So these, this is, again, we're talking about the plane of the box, right? Of the cube. Can't go past. From that cube, there's this gravitational force pushing down as I radiate up. And it's going to, as these things, they're beginning to have this dance, this interchange between the two, and they're trying to seek this point of stillness. When the borrowing is fully paid, the ball comes to rest. From that point, it must again borrow the energy from space, which it borrowed from Earth, to pay for its return to Earth. Upon its accelerative journey to Earth, it passes each point at the same speed it registered on the upward half of the cycle, thus discharging space and equally charging Earth to balance all borrowings and payings. All action in natures actions are blue. They're cold. This is what we learned last week. They're cold. They're female. They're negative. Our extensions, reactions are red. They're positive. They're male. From 0 to 0 and back again to 0. All are balanced simultaneously and sequentially. This is a 0 universe of plus minus 0, which never exceeds the 0 of one light from which it seemingly sprang as multiplicity. So we're going to stop there before we get into the two opposite electric conditions. Again, here we are expressing blue and red, hot and cold, positive, negative, male, female, father, mother, yin, yang. So within this relationship of balanced, equal balanced interchange, there's this giving and receiving, this charging and discharging. So as one charges, it discharges. It has to seek this balance of zero to become equally balanced. So before we end, are there any questions or comments about what we covered today? All right then. So with that being said, I will stop sharing and stop recording, and we can speak privately and wrap up. Okay. So everybody, thank you for joining this discussion today. I am Will Harold, the Energy Hunter with Akashic Intelligence, the original AI, coming to you from the Rogue River with the Walter Russell Secret of Light group. Please like and subscribe or comment and tell us what you're thinking about. Are we on the right track? Are we talking about things that relate to you? How can we make this discussion better? Thank you so much.